Rob and Chris and Tom and all you others, thank you very, very much. And thank you for giving me the privilege of watching all those wonderful people come up for their awards and taking great pride and satisfaction in being with them on the same night. Now, I have to begin with a warning. I met my wife over across the river 46 years ago. Well, actually, it was 47 because I was thinking of the anniversary. She came from Iowa. Her father was a lawyer. He was pining for her to marry a lawyer who could take over the practice. And when he discovered that she was going to accept my proposal and she was going to marry a student of philosophy, graduate student of the history and philosophy of religion, he didn't see much income in that and thought he'd be supporting his wife for a long, long time. He didn't understand one thing. My own father had told me, Michael, never argue religion or politics. People get too passionate and you can't settle any arguments. I thought about that several years, and I thought there's got to be a career in that. But I do need to warn you, my father-in-law used to say to me at least once a year, he called me my son-in-law the celestial physicist. And he would say to me at least once a year, Michael, if you can't do it, teach it. I was teaching at Stanford as my first position after leaving Harvard, and my class, I was very young and very easily influenced, and my small seminar class asked me to, it's such a beautiful day, why not meet this afternoon around the swimming pool, which is a few blocks away. And being innocent, I said, sure. And we were doing okay, but not complete concentration. For example, one of the young women was twirling her nose plug and it flew out of her hands and plopped into the water, which the four young men in class made as if to dive in and retrieve it for her. She said, stop. She said, I want Professor Novak to get it. Now, I was easily impressed, but I said, why me? And she gave me that cold look in the eyes, which only a woman can give you, and said, because nobody I know can dive down deeper, stay down longer, and come up drier. I'm going to ask you to go a little bit more into metaphysics tonight than you're probably used to at a dinner, but I hope it proves useful to you. My subject is the end of the secularist age. I don't mean secular. Secular is a good word. It's a Christian word, invented to describe all those things which belong to the city of man, to which the city of God is addressed. And God the Creator made it. It has its own goodness and aspirations and incompleteness. But it's important for Christians, and if we're going to be leaven in the dough, that's the dough we have to be put into. We have to respect it. So we're not going to end the secular age, but the secularist age are people who think that's all there is, who want to close off the city of man to any sense of the numinous, the transcendent, the sacred, to God, and to the perspective of eternity. That age, I think, is coming to an end, and I take as my mentor in this Europe's best-known popular philosopher, Jürgen Habermas, who describes himself as an atheist. He's well known for defending atheism all the time. Yet since September 11, 2001, in a series of lectures and essays, Habermas has begun to question the limits of secularism, and he expresses appreciation for a few aspects of the religions that call attention to a dimension of transcendence and profoundly defend the dignity, liberty, and responsibility of every human individual, values which he thinks is crucial to a true secular vision. Habermas begins by noting that secularism has been pushed to a new position in history, in world history. It now appears to be the persuasion of a small minority in a sea of rising religious commitment. But he asks, has secularism, this small minority, acquired the internal resources to enter into respectful dialogue with religious peoples instead of mocking them? Two facts suggest to him that secularism lacks these resources. First, the hypothesis that the human world is becoming increasingly secular, it's the so-called Secularization Thesis, which was very much in vogue when I was at Harvard in the 1960s, appears to have been decisively falsified. I remember I sat down with the chairman of the department when I showed up for my fellowship, and he said, "We were very glad to see you wanted to study the philosophy of God." He said, "We don't get many of those." And the last one we got stopped believing in God before the end of 1 year. The second reason these resources are lacking is that a powerful religious awakening around the world suggests to him, to Habermas, that secularist Europe is the anomaly, not the norm, the exception. And even in Europe, by the way, things are percolating quite remarkably. By the end of the 20th century, he goes on, the burgeoning force of religion around the world is undeniable. The question may be less whether religion will survive than in what form secularism will survive. Now, we're under fire, we're in a big fight. It may not appear to us that way, but I want to insist tonight that that's the underlying logic. Things are already in place to bring that about. Habermas himself raises 4 questions about the limits of secularism, the weaknesses of secularism. Do most secularists have the tools and the moral stamina to carry out an honest, respectful conversation after so many generations of contempt for religion? Freud wrote The Future of an Illusion. That was the big book when I was at Harvard. We're all under illusion. Dawkins writes The Delusion. Christopher Hitchens speaks of religion as a poison. It poisons everything. Now, that's a heck of a way to begin a conversation. I mean, how do you look eye to eye and talk after that? The Enlightenment itself, it was a great thing in human history and achieved very much good. Many of our medical successes and other things come from that. On the other hand, in its very name, it committed one of the most outstanding bits of bigotry in history. Imagine calling yourself the bright ones, the enlightened, and all you other poor folks are in darkness and ignorant. Again, it's a great way to begin a conversation. It's really respecting people. Honesty demands, secondly, that secular people recognize that their language, their concepts, are owed to Judaism and Christianity. Liberty, fraternity, equality. Fraternity obviously entered the world through Jesus Christ. It didn't come from Plato or Aristotle. Equality. Aristotle and Plato didn't believe in equality. They thought that some human beings are naturally superior to others. And liberty. It was only through Judaism first, and then in Judaism we learn from the Bible that every single story, every single narrative has as its axis the human will. What will humans do with their will? One chapter, King David is faithful to the Lord. The next chapter, he's not. And the suspense always is, what will he do next? And so, particularly you see it in Christianity, that the weight of this decision comes down more and more on the individual. St. Paul was the first to show this so beautifully in his life. It's the year of St. Paul. He was called to make a decision for Christ, not because he wanted to, he was knocked off his horse, and to make a decision against his own community. He had been stoning Christians for their blasphemy, because from an Orthodox Jewish point of view, it is a blasphemy for someone who's human to call himself God. It's a horrible thing, shocking thing. And therefore, to understand vividly in his own life what it is like to be an individual, in a certain way, breaking from family, breaking from people, to join a new community, go in a new direction, and to be responsible to his own conscience. And that's the origin of autobiography, as in St. Augustine. That's the origin of the importance of the voyage of every single soul, the importance of every single individual. As it says in the Torah, our names are, before time was, God knew us, one by one. So between Judaism and Christianity, this is an extraordinary focus in human history on the individual as part of a community, part of a brotherhood and sisterhood. Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Jesus says to him. Poor Paul, he never met Jesus. How could he have persecuted him? But Paul knew in that instant that Jesus identifies himself with a community. That's where he's found. And if you persecute anybody in that community, you're persecuting me. And that community is potentially the whole human race. So any persecution of anybody is persecuting me. Today, third, we live in post-secular societies. From time to time, the best and highest secular ideals, human rights, solidarity, equality, benefit, Habermas says, from renewed contact with the nimbus of their sacred origins. All these things come from sacred religious origins. And even if you're secular, you have to see that it helps to have these renewed from time to time. And he asks, will most secular men, women and men see the wisdom in that? He doesn't think they will, but that's the limit of secularism. Fourth, are secular men and women ready to admit that toleration is always a two-way street? Not only must religious persons be ready to learn toleration for the convictions and commitments of others, including secularists, in a similar way, non-believing secularists must learn to appreciate the creeds, reasonings, and convictions of their fellow human beings who are believers. That is what a new post-secular age will demand. Treating one another with respect. I sometimes think that the worst intolerance of today is that the people who demand tolerance, but who never show it for those who disagree with them. Now, let me go on. Some newly discovered incapacities of secularism. For so many generations, secularists have assumed that the triumph of secularism is fast approaching. But evidence shows that there are also, in the secularist worldview, certain significant incapacities. Irving Kristol, my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, mentions two in particular, and he did this about 20 years ago. First, the philosophical rationalism of secular humanism can, at best, provide us with the necessary assumptions of a moral code, but it cannot deliver any code itself. It can't give you anything you pass on to your children as a moral code. Non-judgmentalism is not a moral code. It's an abdication. And, judging is the most human, most central act of human beings. You can tell a professor you have a lousy memory. He takes pride in it. Professors are supposed to. One thing you can't tell them is you have lousy judgment. That goes right to the heart of things when you say that. Even if you say brilliant insights, that's not such a good comment because most of them don't work. But judgment, that's the heart of the human being. I teach my children they should make at least 12 judgments before noontime. You should learn to distinguish good from evil, beautiful from ugly, true from false. And the more often you make those judgments, the better practice you get, the better those judgments become. If you avoid them, you never learn. The second flaw in secular humanism is even more fundamental. If there is one, Irving Kristol, if there is one indisputable fact about the human condition, it is that no community can survive if it is persuaded or even suspects that its members are leading meaningless lives in a meaningless universe. If you really think that there's no God and there's nothing but chaos and chance, dice on the table, thrown an infinite number of times, how do you expect ordinary people to put up with the grind and suffering that life throws at them? The cancers and the auto accidents and the deformed children and the sudden diseases that cripple old or young, and hard work, sometimes boring work. How do you expect them to put up with that if you're teaching them their lives are meaningless, don't mean a thing? And that's why Kristol says that at its heart, secularism has already died. It started in a first flush of enthusiasm, but as we've gone through several generations, we discover it just can't do certain crucial things. He said it's still flourishing through the institutions, it's growing like crazy, but at its heart it's dead. And that reminds me of a conversation I had with Cardinal Ratzinger in the early 1980s. Imagine, the early 1980s, and he said, we asked him what his biggest concern was around the world, and somebody said Marxism. He said Marxism is dead. He said no serious person, East or West, can take it seriously as a philosophy. Oh, it'll go on. It's still got armies. But he said that's not a worry anymore. That argument's done. And I was stunned when he said that. He turned out to be absolutely right. Within 5 years, the wall fell down, but nobody saw that I was aware of in 1984 or 1983. And Irving Kristol is saying the same thing about secularism. The rot is complete on the inside, but the beast is still moving. Third, the problem of moral decadence. Ever since the fall of Rome, historians and philosophers have noted that civilizations often fall by way of moral decadence. What tools does secularism possess to arrest such decadence? Abraham Lincoln said this most beautifully, that morals go in generations. The generation of the founding had to be heroic. John Adams turned down an invitation to be the king's lawyer in America and joined the Party for Independence, whose loss meant he would be hanged and his children disgraced forever as traitors. Oh, you're an Adams. You're a traitor. These people were heroes. Every one of them put their lives on the line. And he says the second generation tries hard to emulate them and be as good as their fathers. But they're not. And the third generation gets tired of hearing about them and goes a different way. He said he called it the silent artillery of time. The human race achieves a certain level and then how does a secularist society even diagnose moral decadence? By whose standards? If you don't have any standards. The universal ethic of reason. Secularism stemming from the Enlightenment has been unable to keep its promise of forging a universal consensus of an ethics based on reason alone. This circumstance seems to be what Nietzsche meant when he observed that no man of reason should rejoice in the death of God. Experience will soon show, he was certain, that with the death of God arrives the death of reason. Reasoned debate will be replaced by naked will. You think what you think, I think what I think. There's no way to, we must be tolerant. There's no way to judge between us. All equal and all nothing. And so the only way for society to move on are the people with the strongest will and the most determined will to insist on it and override the other people who are uncertain about what to say, whether to resist, how to organize themselves. That's almost the situation we were in, and MFI is one example around the country of organizations that have stepped up and decided to fight. Human suffering, tragedy, evil. Secularism has little to say about human suffering, brokenness, tragedy, remorse, evil. I mean, they see everything as chance. The dinosaurs dying. 85% of all the species who've ever lived are disappeared. That's nature. Secularism is not altogether speechless in the face of death. If you've been to the death of secular people, the funerals can be quite moving in their way, in their testimonials to virtue or valor. Yet its voice does sound faint, the voice about meaning and purpose for us. What has secularism to say to the vulnerable that it does not borrow from Judaism and Christianity? Both Bertrand Russell in the 1920s and Richard Rorty until his recent death, some of the most famous philosophers in American popular culture, have confessed that they just plain stole one of their central values, compassion, or in the new word, solidarity, from Jesus Christ. Rorty writes he didn't learn that from Kant or Aristotle or Plato. The Greeks left their little babies out in the woods to die. He learned it from Christ. Christ is the one who introduced into the world the sense of brotherhood, sisterhood, compassion. So, now, two upcoming crises before which secularism is rather weak. Islamofascism and demography. Islamofascism because if you don't believe there are any objective standards, who's to judge who's right or wrong? It's all equal. And our new atheist writers almost all put religion, they think that's one thing, and we're all lumped together. Look, there are so few world religions that really, it's just a handful, not more than a dozen, not even that many. It's not too burdensome to take them one by one and examine them. Our fathers spoke at the time of the American founding about false religions and true. That's a normal way of speaking. There's a way of reason itself to discern among these. C.S. Lewis, when he became a Christian, when he had his sudden conversion, understood that he'd have to be part of a community, which church to join. And he began to think about that. And one of the criteria that appealed to him is it has to be universal. If it comes from one creator, the church, let me put it this way, closest to the true church in that sense, has to at least be one of those that is universal. And here he found only 3 claimants, and then examined other claims. I mean, it's a work of reason in a way to get that far. I mean, some people are hit by a burst of light or grace, but when they try to justify it to themselves, they have to go back and take apart the steps. And demography. In 5 more minutes, the bottom falls out from underneath this platform, and I just disappear. I've got a very tough taskmaster here. So I will go, play it like basketball, and I'll keep shooting till the whistle blows. Secularism seems to give no motive to young men and women to have children in sufficient numbers to reproduce themselves, plus a little more to allow for future growth. Secularism seems to serve up motives for not having children, whether out of perceived moral duties to the environment or fears of overpopulation, when we're really facing underpopulation in the future, or simply a preference for enjoying a relatively carefree life. In Europe, the more secular the country, the higher proportion of secularists in the country, the lower the population growth. And the people who are having children are the religious people. The Muslims, of course, but also those Christians who attend church at least once a week, and Orthodox practicing Jews, they're the ones having 3, 4, 5 children. And that's not enough to make up, but that's the only place there's growth. You know, having children is a vote for the future. Having children is an affirmation. It's a trust in life. And if you don't have that trust in life or in the future or in the reasonableness of things, why bring children into it? Atheism and the president of the Italian Senate, Marcello Pera, a marvelous man, and Cardinal Ratzinger wrote a book called Without Roots: The West, Relativism, Christianity, Islam. It grew out of a correspondence between them. Marcello Pera is not an atheist, but he's not a believer. He's a wonderful humanist. But he wrote to Cardinal Ratzinger after a lecture of Ratzinger's he read, and they went back and forth, and then they decided to publish them. They argued that atheism is really an intellectually impossible position. Nobody can prove it. You can't prove a negative. And so it's a faith. I mean, if that's what you want to believe, go ahead and believe it, but you're jumping. Agnosticism seems much more attractive and modest and humble. I don't know. But they point out it's a wonderful little twist I like a lot. I think it's sensible. You can't act agnosticism. You can say agnosticism, but every time you make an act, every time you make a decision, every time you do something, you're acting as if God exists or as if God does not exist. And your actions are telling you which one you believe. So in a way, it's a self-deception to speak of agnosticism. It's usually, for most people, a way station when they don't quite know which way they're going to end up. So I'm not trying to mock it. I'm just trying to say why some of us find it intellectually inadequate. An eighth point, and I think I only have one more to go, Ron. Oh, Rob. Science needs supportive habits, Habermas points out. Science is not just a method. It also requires habits of honesty and hard work and being able to work in a communion with others, which is mutual trust. Where do people learn these habits? It's the great blessing of our civilization which produced the science that it was tutored by 5,000 years of belief in a God, the Creator, who understands all things and wants us to use our brains and discover them. And taught our kids the habits necessary to do that. You are going to do your arithmetic. Secular humanism is an island. I'll be shorter here because I've already said that. Habermas' big questions: how can a small island of people committed to reason and to science long survive in a great ocean of peoples who see in science and reason engines of demoralization and cultural decadence? Where are science and reason going to get the young people disciplined to the virtues and habits you need to practice science and reason? You have to think of the culture that will support them. What mothers teach their children and fathers need to insist on. Finally, Ratzinger and Habermas. Ratzinger challenged Habermas to a debate. Ratzinger was a cardinal then. And to everybody's surprise, Habermas ended up saying he tended to agree with Ratzinger. And I've made some of the points that he made in that lecture and what I've said. He wanted to defend the importance of Judaism and Christianity, and he wanted to insist that atheists, secularist people have a duty to recognize that. It's a fact. Recognize it. Deal with it. Like my grandson said to me, "Grandpa, you don't understand." He said, "I don't like to read." He said, "Deal with it." Unbelievable. And then Ratzinger made 3 points about religious people. This is it. First, the secular intellect is always necessary to curb and to correct some of the toxic temptations of religion. There just is a tendency to fanaticism in it. We know some very religious people who drive us crazy, the way they talk about things. And so you need Second, neither contemporary secular reason nor any individual religion has yet adequately come to understand other powerful cultural currents on earth. If you look around the world, it's amazing how much we don't know about Islam and Hinduism and so on and so forth. Neither secularism nor... And so we all of us who believe in reason and faith need to work together to get a better grasp on what this thing humanity is. And lastly, that there are certain creative energies and intuitions that Christianity can bring to a secular society. The secular is a legitimate regime with its own special autonomy, rules, and privileges, but also with its own responsibilities and self-inflicted limitations. There can be, there is, there ought to be, there must be a respectful conversation between the religious and the secular. And I congratulate you folks for trying to get that conversation going in a very difficult environment in Massachusetts. Thank you very much.